The Strange Abduction of Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble, Part 1. Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble. Written by Laurie Ann Pokin. Narrated by Graham Mack. For Bindi. Prologue. The only food he had in the place for her was made of plastic. Bumpy brown plastic burger patties, green rubber lettuce, bright yellow floppy cheese squares, triangle slices of plastic pizza. Those fit into a grey bendy dish, like a puzzle. And the icebox and cabinets were full of the stuff too. The place was made up of just 2 rooms. The kitchen and living room were one, and the doorless bedroom, which had a seatless toilet in the corner, was the other. After the second day, or maybe it was the third, for there was no way to really keep track of time, except somewhat by how her tight curls began to fall and her nail polish grew out. Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble got so hungry, she started to wonder if maybe the plastic was just a wrapper. That maybe there really was beef inside the brown plastic burger patties and cheese and dough within the triangle slices of plastic pizza. There was a whole shelf of colorful cereal boxes in the cupboard. And when she grabbed the first one, it had some weight to it and rattled when she shook it. As careful as could be, she pulled open the cardboard tab and gently unrolled the cellophane bag within, her mouth already watering. But it was full of Legos. She did her best to roll the cellophane back down, close the lid, and return it to the shelf, just the way she'd found it. She moved on to the next box, handling it slow and careful as she had the first. But it turned out to be full of puzzle pieces, and that made her think of Paul. Paul liked his puzzles. No, Paul loved his puzzles. But was that the truth of it? Maybe it was that he liked being at home, and puzzles just gave him something to do. A reason. No, an excuse to be home. He wasn't yet 40, but lived like an old-timer. So when he asked her if she wanted to have a drink last week, in a roundabout but polite as can be sort of way, she told him no. Even though he'd been fixing the same food at the same place for nigh on 15 years, he never took shortcuts. He prepared each plate as if it was for his own mama. Bowling alley or not, his was the best in town. Freddy'd even told him so. But it made her wonder, and she wasn't one to often wonder, why he was still at the bowling alley. When he asked if he could cook her dinner some night at his place, she also told him no. The funny thing was, he'd done it anyway, cooked for her. He brought it in the next day, and it wasn't some fried bowling alley food. He'd fixed thinly sliced prime rib roast with garlic and chive mashed sweet potatoes, peppers and red onions sautéed in olive oil, roasted asparagus topped with melted parmesan and salt, and homemade cornbread with brown gravy. And there was even a napkin and a fine thermos of sweet tea. All that after she told him no, and no again. Why was she thinking about Paul the cook anyways? It couldn't be Paul. No, it must be the food. Paul's food. But what she saw in her mind was not just his food, but his hands preparing it. Paul's hands. She moved on to the next cereal box and found that, like the first two, it was not filled with cereal. It was filled with the torn-up cardboard of another cereal box, as if the cereal had gotten so hungry it had eaten its own. There were plastic waffles and egg cartons full of empty Easter eggs in the icebox, and even the window was fake, just drawn on. She ran her finger over the blue sky, and it pilled under her long painted nail, waxy like crayon. The little waxy balls gave her something soft to chew, and there was a faint taste of barbecue sauce. But she worried the scrapes would be noticed, so did her best to stop. The bowl on the living room table was full of dust-coated fake fruit, and the TV stared at her, blank and grey and stagnant, like everything else. There was a shelf of records, but no record player. The floor lamps had no light bulbs, and she found no outlets. There were fluorescent lights in the ceiling, and they were always on, and she could find no switch to make them stop. It was like being trapped in a model home, but it didn't have that model home smell. She was 5'6", 7 with her work shoes on, and the ceiling was low, like a basement. So when she stood on tiptoe and reached, she could graze the ceiling panels with the tips of her fingers. But it didn't smell like a basement. In fact, the only thing she could smell was herself. The perfume she'd dabbed on her wrists, neck, and behind her ears 3, or had it been 4, days ago, was still there. But it was made stale by her sweat and unbrushed teeth. The only thing that worked, aside from the icebox and ceiling lights, was the toilet with its pull chain, and since nothing came out of the kitchen sink, and the milk carton in the refrigerator was just like the food, Freddy had only one way to quench her thirst. She still wore her uniform, a pink short-sleeved dress, nude pantyhose, white non-slip kitty heels, and a pastel blue apron with the words "Little Bert's Lanes and Games" at the top, and a cartoon picture of a black bowling ball with only legs, chasing 2 white pins with only arms, and "I got your 6" at the bottom. And she wore this as she lay on the hard, twin mattress on the bedroom floor beside the seatless toilet, comforted in only a thin sheet and flat, stained pillow. Her feet throbbed as she stared up at the low fluorescent ceiling. They felt fat and wet. Maybe they were bleeding, or maybe it was just sweat. She looked down. Her legs were unblemished and firm, but stubbly, and her feet, they looked like little kid feet, chubby, the swollen, taut skin pushing against the strap restraints of the white shoes. But still she kept them on. Except to use the toilet, she never took anything off. At home, in her big waterbed, she'd sleep in just breeches and an oversized T-shirt, wrapped within a tangle of sheets and quilts, and encased by an abundance of mismatched pillows. But as she lay on the small, hard mattress, the stinking flat pillow, and the thin sheet, she tried to remember the in-between, the missing time, from after she left work and before waking up in this place. She pulled her blue apron up over her face and breathed in the lingering smell of fatback and maple syrup. She closed her eyes and thought about 3 days ago. Or had it been 4? Chapter 1. Plainfield. Plainfield was a small, flat, middle-of-nowhere place with long, wide, empty roads, perpetually shadowed beneath dark clouds and surrounded by cornfields. It rained a lot. Thunderstorms every day, with lightning and tornadoes, and there was a lonesome, forlorn feeling that only folks passing through seemed to notice. And when the folks passing through drove on, the bad feeling was forgotten, like a nightmare soon after waking. And that middle-of-nowhere town, what was it called again, was forgotten too. When Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble was 7, Daddy left and never came back. Hardly anyone born in Plainfield ever left. But when they did, they always never came back. When Freddy turned 17, she packed her satchel, slung it over her bony shoulder, and sneaked out the door. She made her way as far from Mama and Mama's friend as the babysitting money in her skirt pocket could take her. The other side of Plainfield. Now 28 years old, Freddy worked at Bert's Lanes and Games as a waitress and sometimes bartender, and had for the last 11 years. Be 12 next month. The bus stop was 1 mile from the bowling alley, and the only amenities along the way were Blondie's beef shakes, the church house, and the W&S truck stop, which had a payphone, and the Riverwalk pantry, which was attached to the truck stop, where they kept the cooler just cold enough to keep the milk from turning. All the way. There wasn't anything else, save for miles and miles of cornfields. Chapter 2. May 3rd, 1972. The night Freddy went missing. Freddy stepped off the bus, and her white kitty heels ground against the wet rubble of the dirt road. She wore her pink short-sleeved dress, nude pantyhose, and had a big bag slung over her thin shoulder. Her lunchbox, thermos, the thermos Paul said she could just keep, umbrella, and pocketbook within. Narrow streams of sunlight pierced through dark clouds, and the smell of rain was thick. The bus puffed and chugged and farted black plumes as it disappeared down the long empty road, and she stood alone, listening to the wind rustle through the cornfields. The other girls who took the bus wore their street clothes, changing into their uniforms and fixing their hair and faces when they got to work. So they all took the earlier bus, which meant Freddy walked alone. But she didn't worry about things too much, unless it was what to fix for supper. Except sometimes a certain something, a something buried deep within the recesses of her memory, dug in its dirty claws and crawled forward until Freddy could do nothing but wonder, where had Daddy gone? He had been a daddy who took her fishing and told stories without a book, who explained things straight and calm and was partial to his worn coveralls and his pipe with its cherry tobacco. She knew of the big city way up north. Almost 7 hours by car it was. How long would it take walking? And did a bus even go that far? She didn't know. All she knew was that Mama said that's where her rotten daddy went, that he'd walked himself right out the front door and kept on, all the way to that sodden, forsaken concrete jungle. All these years later, she imagined her daddy still walking his way, all those miles north, and as far as she knew, it could be true. And as far as she knew, when he finally got there, he'd call, and that truck stop payphone would ring, and it'd be her daddy on the other end. She guessed that's what she'd done too when she was 17, except she'd only made it 84 miles, and no one ever came looking for her. She figured Mama never called the law after her, for Mama'd never called when Daddy left. Freddy walked that long mile down Wagon Farm Road, then cut through the pockmarked parking lot and up the cracked walkway, where sagging strings of Christmas lights hung on either side. Half the little bulbs had burned out long ago, but it was still pretty at night. And on the pink garbage can beside the front doors, someone had carved "Suggestion Box," and she couldn't help but read those words every time she passed by. Be 12 years next month. And above the doors glowed a neon sign, "Little Bert's Lanes and Games." Chapter 3. The Bowling Alley. Sunlight streamed in hazy through the foggy front doors of Little Bert's Lanes and Games, where the bowling shoes were so worn and stretched everybody had to go down a size for them to fit. Most shifts, Freddy worked the kitchen, taking orders, carrying food to the lanes, and bussing tables, interrupted every couple of hours with some kind of cleaning. The worst, aside from the toilets, were the barbecued chicken wings, and everybody loved Paul's wings. Aside from the mounds of stained napkins, it was the sticky fingerprints you'd find just about everywhere. You had to sort of scrape at it. Eventually, just used your fingernails. But once in a while, Bert let her work the bar. At the bar, you'd fix drinks, mind the pool tables, keep the counter dry, and pass out cardboard coasters with the cartoon picture of a black bowling ball with only legs chasing 2 white pins with only arms. Little Bert's Lanes and Games at the top, and "I Got Your 6" at the bottom. Old-timers loved to take those things home. It wasn't as loud in the bar as it was up front. What with the music, explosion of pins and cheering. Folks didn't get loud in the bar until after about 10 at night, and it wasn't always the fun kind of loud you'd find on the lanes. And that's why Dalton kept a close eye on the bar, and Freddy. Bert only had him in on Friday and Saturday nights, typical nights when any place with alcohol was apt to get a little rough, even a bowling alley. Save for the gun holstered on his hip and the gold badge secured beside it, Dalton looked like a regular fella. Flannel shirt, old leather belt, worn jeans and boots. Sometimes he parked his dusty Crown Vic out front, and other times Bert had him tuck it in the back. And he was part of the place, like everybody else. 2 nights a week, anyway. Bert and Paul told Freddy that if she kept it up, they might put her in the bar full time. Bartenders made 85 cents more an hour and got holidays off. But it wasn't just the pay and time off. No, there was something more to it. When you stood behind the bar, folks saw you different, treated you different. Different than when you were on your knees scraping barbecue sauce. And she found herself longing for Friday and Saturday nights. The nights when Dalton worked. When he would be near, and she felt what? More than once, Paul asked Freddy if she'd fallen asleep with her eyes open. She'd tried to laugh it off, tried to hide what she'd been thinking about. When Dalton was near, a hot ache crawled up her flat belly and spread like a spider web from the tips of her delicate fingers to the ends of her little toes. But it hadn't always been that way. She hadn't always noticed Dalton. Not until last year, when, for the first time, Bert let Freddy work the bar. The place had been ablaze with talking and cheering, balls thundering down lanes, the sharp clack of pin smashing and strobe lights dancing in the darkness. Bert had only ever let Freddy shadow Sammy, just half a dozen times in all her 11 years, and she'd never been allowed to actually touch anything. She'd just stand in the corner and watch the older gal fix drinks and earn her tips and work the men, and the women too. But even just standing there, doing nothing but watching, Freddy felt like she was 1,000 miles away. 1,000 miles. 1,000 miles from serving food to folks who sometimes gave only a grunt in thanks. From cleaning speckled toilet bowls and picking barbecue sauce off bowling balls with fingernails. But it wasn't just that stuff. All those years ago, she'd come to this place with nothing, and Bert had taken a chance on her. By means of scrubbing, mopping, and scraping, because of this place, because of Bert, she was eventually able to buy her own trailer, a thrift store love seat, a bed, a few different dresses, couple pair of shoes, ate meat once a week, and had pocket change for bingo twice a month. But she'd been walking the same roads, cleaning the same toilets, serving the same food to the same people at the same place, all the same, since she was 17. Until she stepped behind the bar. Sammy told her the worst drunks ever did was get a little loud and a little rude. Said she had nothing to worry about, that they saved the worst for each other out in the parking lot. The men threw punches, and the women slapped, and then they all went home. Why then was Freddy frightened? A feeling she never felt on the lanes. There was something inside her that made her want to go back to the kitchen with Paul and tell Bert the bar wasn't for her, that she shouldn't do it. Something told her she should stay working as a server and cleaner forever and always, and the rest of her life. Just as she'd been doing all these years, since she was 17. Just as Paul the cook would be just Paul the cook for the rest of his life. When Freddy was little, Mama sometimes yelled at Daddy, and sometimes, it seemed, at nothing at all. But Dalton never yelled. Dalton's eyes were dark, and his hair darker still, and when young women came in, younger than Freddy, She couldn't help but wonder if Dalton took notice. "You hearing me?" Sammy said. Freddy, standing in the dark corner behind the bar, looked up at the tall, rail-thin lady who only ever ate fried food, drank her beer warm, and her whiskey straight. "Yes'm," Freddy nodded. "All right," Sammy drawled. "I give you the rundown one last time. 'Cause really tonight be your first night." She pointed. "What's these here?" "Beer glasses." "Huh." She smacked her lips. "And these?" "For mixed drinks." "Huh. And don't use a shot glass. Just eyeball measure like I showed." Sammy's jaw twitched from side to side as she had a habit of chewing her dentures. "What if I pour too much?" She shook her head as if it was the darnest thing she'd ever heard. "Bert don't carry you over, Pa. Rather you over than under. What makes regulars regulars? Just don't spill is all. Now listen here." She chewed a minute. "It's only about last call when you gets any kind of trouble. But you be all right. Hearing me now?" "Yes'm." "Well then, ask questions, you got any?" She picked some white stuff from the corner of her thin lips. "I'll be out here with you for a bit. Then you're on your own." The first few hours were easy, even fun. But 15 minutes after the rush of last call, the crooked tables were full. There wasn't an open bar stool. Men crowded the pool tables, and folks couldn't move without bumping someone else. "All right," Sammy looked around approvingly. "Show yours." "I got her," Freddy grinned. "Well, I hope so. Ain't rocket science." Sammy grunted and swept past Freddy into the back room and slammed the door behind her. Freddy stood alone. The bottles of liquor and different syrups sparkled beneath the neon signs. The beer glasses, shot glasses, and tall glasses for mixed drinks stood neat and erect on the shelves. And there was kind of a sense of power being behind the bar, all on her own, in control of the sparkling, breakable things before her, in control of how fun a person's night might get. People were different when they were after liquor instead of food, and different still when it was beer instead of liquor, and wine instead of beer. The room had become the heart of the bowling alley, and Freddy was at its center. 3 men sat at the far end of the bar. She should have gone over to them. Should have done it 10 minutes ago. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She kept to the opposite side from them, wiping the counter with that filthy checkered rag, even though the counter was dry. "Gimme her number," the big one with the hard face said. Warren was his name, so she'd overheard. And he was growing louder, and his eyes redder. "Let it alone." The fella in the middle with the bulging stomach and skinny legs leaned away, and, for the first time, he did not meet Warren's eyes, but stared straight ahead and sipped the warm, flat beer that lingered at the bottom of his glass. "Hey, War," the short one with the thinning hair on the end said in a kind of pleading way, and his thick eyebrows rose as if in surrender. "He likes her." He gestured toward the man in the middle. "Likes her a lot." "Yeah." Warren leaned back in his bar stool, his legs splayed apart as he swiveled to face the other 2. "Yeah, so why don't you let up about it?" He laughed a little. "You know?" "Gimme a number," Warren said. "You ain't married." "Wouldn't matter to you if he was," the man in the middle muttered, and his eyes stayed downcast on the bar as he slowly turned the dirty beer glass in his small hand. Warren leaned toward him. Their size difference made even more drastic, for Warren was the biggest man in the room. All right, ha! The man with the thinning hair tried to laugh again, but it was an uneasy, strained noise. Let's let it alone a minute. The three of them fell silent. As she wiped the already dry counter, Freddy felt a prickling, tickling, as the hair on the back of her neck stood up. Hey, honey. A quiet but deep voice broke through the raucous noise of the bar. Look at me. She didn't look, but from the corner of her eye saw that Warren was staring at her. The man in the middle let out a loud sigh and swiveled in his bar stool and stared at the pool game going on in the far corner. After a moment, the man on the end with the thinning hair did the same. And although the bar was full of people, laughter and conversation, the kind you only have when you're drunk, Freddy felt alone, trapped, with the man at the end of the bar, the big man called Warren. She glanced up and met his glowing eyes, a predator's eyes, and it was almost startling, like when you turn and find a cat staring at you. And his eyes, although piercing, were also bloodshot and half open. But she could not help the sudden thought of how they might look when he had his wits about him. Like in the morning. First thing in the morning. She tried to shake off the obtrusive thought. I'm not allowed to give out my telephone number, she blurted, and dropped her gaze. Ha! He laughed. How'd you know what I was thinking? Huh? How you know I wasn't just after another beer? He bit his lower lip and leaned on the bar, almost childlike. But now you mention it. Come on, he teased. I'll be nice. Won't call you too late. She turned and peeked through the window of the back door. But Sammy was gone. What you looking for? He smirked and ran his wet tongue over his lips, making them glisten. I'm right here. As she turned to face him, she caught a glimpse, just a glimpse as it passed by, through the dusty barroom window that looked out into the hall, of a tall, broad-shouldered figure. A man. And although she could not make out his features through the dark distance, she got the feeling he was watching her. Got a great posterior. Warren muttered, and let out a low whistle. Give it, 9. 10. If I could touch. His straight white teeth peeked through his wet lips. Face? He squinted. 8.5. The man in the middle suddenly got up and walked over to the pool tables, and the one on the end, empty beer glass in hand, followed. But Warren never took his eyes off Freddy. He slid over the 2 empty bar stools so he was closer to her. Nah, he said after a moment. Changed my mind. Face is closer to a 7 than I thought. She stood there motionless, trying not to look at him. So, she whispered, and took a small step back. You want another beer? But something in his face, his eyes, had changed. Look like you've been sipping cherry Kool-Aid, he said in a flat, low voice. You got them lips. Them red lips, and the look in his eyes, that piercing stare of a hunter, seemed to have spread over his massive body, and he looked bigger than before. How pretty. Those two words came out light as a feather on his whispered breath, and his staring, unblinking eyes were steady on her face. A kind of stare she'd never seen before. She couldn't help wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, even though she never wore lipstick, and hadn't sipped Kool-Aid since she was running around barefoot, spinning on tire swings. Her whole body felt hot, and all at once, breathing was like sucking air through a straw. She thought of flinging herself into the back room, but the door had no lock. She thought of crouching behind the bar, pretending to look for something, but there was nowhere he wouldn't be able to see her. So instead, she stood, wiping down one beer glass after another. There was a crooked sort of boyish grin on his face, and the longer he looked at her that way, the more she understood that he'd already seen her dry those glasses an hour ago, that he'd been watching her. And as she began to wonder if he could see her heart slamming in her breast, his thick arm, as quick and sudden as a biting snake, reached out, and he took hold of the end of her checkered towel. He teased and gave it a tug. But Freddy held on to that dirty, damp thing, and so her arm went with it, toward him, and that's when he grabbed her wrist. His hand was big, and her tiny wrist looked even tinier in its grasp. She froze. Time seemed to stand still as they locked eyes. "Oh," he cooed. His voice was soft. "Little wrist you got." He rubbed his warm thumb along the veins of her pale skin, and the touch of him made her gasp. She couldn't help it. Beer and some kind of menthol floated through the air on his breath. Not an entirely unpleasant smell. "Let me go," she whispered. "What for?" he whispered back. "Why, so I can fetch you What you gonna fetch?" he snapped. She licked her lips. "A cold beer for you." He made a strange gurgling noise, and in an instant his hand was off her little wrist, and he was bent forward over the bar, his big arm hitched behind his back. Behind his back, where Dalton stood. "I've been watching." Dalton spoke low to Warren, but kept his dark eyes on Freddy. "Let go of me," Warren ground through his clenched teeth, as slow and calm as could be. Although the way Dalton had his arm pinned, it looked apt to snap. "Get up!" Dalton growled, and walked backward, hauling the red-faced Warren by his twisted arm. "You're gonna break it!" "You keep fussing, you gonna break it!" "I'm not!" Warren shouted. But Freddy saw his body relax. She also saw that his red-rimmed eyes stayed on her. She dropped her gaze. "Come on," Dalton said. "Get your boys to take you home." She watched as Dalton escorted him out of the bar, the two friends following at a distance. "Thank you," Freddy whispered. She picked up empty glasses and beer bottles from the far end of the bar, the end she'd been neglecting, And now she really did need to wipe down the counter with that sodden checkered towel. And in that moment, she felt like a different person. Like a new woman. Like a bartender. "Been gone 15 cotton-picking minutes and the place goes to hell," Sammy shouted as she stormed into the bar. "Ain't never needed the law come in like you just done." She shook her head. "In all my years." "But I didn't call Dalton. I didn't tell him to come back." "Can't handle one drunk? Maybe you're on the wrong side of the alley." Sammy turned and made to go into the back room. "Bert ain't gonna like this." "No, sir." "But Sammy, he grabbed my wrist." "Your wrist? Ha!" She bellowed out a harsh laugh and cupped one of her sagging breasts as a man might clench his groin to emphasize a point. "Go home, Freddy." She went into the back room and slammed the door. Freddy grabbed her coat and bag from under the counter and ran out to the other side of the bar. But all at once, her eyes burned, and she felt like she was falling, like the floor had given way, and she was falling. She had to stop and hide from the pool playing and laughing and drinking and drunk eyes looking at her. She stood in the dark corner, the corner where Warren had sat. Warren's corner, and ran her fingers along a tear in one of the bar stools. She'd never noticed how worn and torn the bar stools were. She stood there like that and swallowed back the tears, and that's when she noticed something on the ground. Two somethings. Beneath the bar stool. She picked them up. A driver's license and a small package. She read the license. Male, 6'3", black hair, brown eyes, 36 years old, weighing 215 pounds. She rolled open the little package and looked within. She touched the soft, somewhat moist contents with the tip of her finger, then sniffed. Menthol. She heard tapping behind her, and when she turned around, Dalton was there, tapping his knuckles on the bar. "Boy leave his license." "What? Oh." She handed it over. "I thought you're not supposed to smile for your ID," she stammered, looking up at him, smiling herself. "I dunno," he mumbled, took the ID, and walked away. She'd really done it this time. And wait till Bert heard what happened. What she let happen. Really, it was her fault. She'd neglected the men. Maybe, if she'd done her job, checked on them regular, gotten them more beer, maybe... Clutched in her other hand, which she'd, for some reason, hidden behind her back when Dalton came around, was Warren's pouch of tobacco. She slipped it into her apron pocket, grabbed her bag and coat, and went home. Chapter 4. May 6th, 1972. Or was it the 7th? Freddy's mouth tasted sour as she still lay in that stinking hard bed. It had been 4 days now, or 5. But her brain had been twisting and turning and seeking and solving and figuring things out all the while, until it found the answer. The plastic was just a wrapper. She almost smiled as she forced herself to sit up. The plastic was just a wrapper. And there really was beef inside the brown plastic burger patties, and cheese and dough within the triangle slices of plastic pizza. Blood rushed from her brain, and for a moment it was hard to breathe. But she did not fight the strange high. She forced herself to her feet, accepting the wooziness, and made the short but unsteady walk to the kitchen. The sound of her heels thumping along the hard, flat carpet, then clicking and clacking across the linoleum kitchen floor, and the buzzing of the unending ceiling lights seemed louder than before. She had only her fingernails and teeth, for there was nothing else sharp in the whole place. No knives or forks, not even a spoon. And none of the drawers in the kitchen, although they had handles, were real. So she sat at the little blue kitchen table in one of the stubby orange chairs and took to gnawing one of those smooth brown plastic burger patties, and went on gnawing well past when her gums started to bleed. She chewed on that thing until she could see within, and for all her efforts, found it was just like her stomach. Empty. She stared at the ragged, jagged edges that surrounded the dark cavity. Empty? Empty. Her mind began again at its frantic twisting and turning, but she was able to quiet its desperate search for meaning and explanation by the hope of the pizza she'd yet to try. She threw the patty to the side and ignored the sound of it sliding off the blue table and tap dancing across the floor to a stop. She peeled a triangle slice of plastic pizza from its bendy grey dish. Her jaw ached on the right side, so she switched to chewing on her left. She started on one of the pointy corners, and it made little squeaky noises like a what? Like a dog toy. They had dogs growing up. Kept the coyote off the chickens. They were always dirty. Allowed inside to curl up beside the fireplace only in the dead of winter. And beside the hearth, in a wicker basket, were kept bones and antlers, a tug made of strips from an old tire, and Freddy's best teddy. But despite the warmth and toys, those dogs couldn't wait to go back outside where they could sniff and chase and roll in dirt and patrol what was home. Home. And they seemed only to play with the contents of that wicker basket for the sake of little Freddy. She smiled at the thought, and it was made crooked by the plastic pizza, shiny with saliva protruding from between her wet lips. Freddy had taken to sometimes talking aloud to herself, but her voice, when she first broke the oppressive silence, was jarring, almost frightening. So she spoke soft, careful, as one might to a lost child. If Carol and Bridge could see her, sitting like this, boy, they'd be fit to split. She laughed, and the pizza squeaked in her mouth like it was laughing too. She chewed until she could peer within, and it was just like the burger patty, which was just like her stomach. Hollow. Chapter 5. May 3rd, 1972. The night Freddy went missing. Continued. When Freddy walked in for her shift, the lanes on the right half of the bowling alley were packed with families and young couples, while the left side was empty, save for an employee setting up those blind railings. But come 5 o'clock, when the Manor Reprieve vans arrived, the place would be swarming with hobbling, wobbling, walker-holding, diaper-wearing cane-wielders, wandering like blind buffalo searching for water, needing bowling shoes, bowling balls, the toilets, food, drinks, the toilets again. And soon after, the left side of the bowling alley would be more packed and raucous than the right. The Old Folks' League was chugged down the dirt road in a little white van every Friday and Saturday night. They trickled in about 5 p.m., got their bumpy, bulky heft situated in hard plastic chairs with food and drink, began warming up at 5:45, started bowling at 6, and by 7:15, they were all half in the bag. A handful of those old folks couldn't perceive anything more than light and had to use a railing to guide them as they bowled. Some of the others could see all right, at least out of one eye, but needed their walkers to make their way down the lane, and then clung to that blind railing with one arm as they chucked their 8-pound ball with the other. And 5 hours later, that dirty little white van came back and swallowed them up and chugged them back to the Manor Reprieve retirement home. She glanced at the clock on the wall, only out of habit, like the garbage can, for she only ever walked in at either 4:59 p.m. if it was raining, or 4:58 p.m. if it was not. It was 4:58 p.m. "Hiya, girl!" Carol hollered, as she swooped past Freddy with a giant tray of barbecue wings and pie, her fat brown curls bouncing with each heavy step. Even when she was close, her voice wasn't any quieter. "Ready for rush hour?" Her curls were vibrant, but her skin and teeth were worn beyond her years, so that when you only saw the backside of her, wide hips, thick calves, and those pretty curls, and heard her loud voice and deep, even louder laughter, when she turned around, the sight of her face was almost shocking. The first time, anyway. But Carol had a big smile, and she smiled a lot, and an even bigger heart. Carol didn't wait for a reply, but kept on keeping on. "Hey, honey," Freddy called over her shoulder as she made her way behind the counter. "What's the pie today?" But Carol was already rounding the corner into the bar. Freddy tucked her belongings underneath the counter and pulled out a clean pastel blue apron from the apron bin. She unfolded it and pulled it over her head and tied the strings in back. On the front it read, "Little Bert's Lanes and Games," and there was a cartoon of a black bowling ball with only legs, chasing 2 white pins with only arms. She picked out a pad of paper and dug around for a pencil with the fewest bite marks and tucked them into the apron pocket. "Freddy! Hello, Freddy! Let me get a butterscotch! Some fries!" Charlie said, huffing and puffing, still 5 feet away as he waddled to the counter. "And, a slice of pumpkin." His big pants had an elastic waistband that wrapped around his distended belly and were held up by suspenders so that it pulled on his crotch and lifted the bottom of the pant leg about 5 inches above his sneakers. And he always kept his T-shirt tucked into those big baggy pants. "Don't even get a hello?" she said as she slid her time card into the machine. 5 o'clock on the dot. Charlie shuffled up to the counter in his sneakers that always looked new, his white socks stretched halfway up his freckled calves. "You got pumpkin fresh today, Freddy?" He leaned against the counter and his swollen, crooked fingers struggled to drag his wallet from his pocket. His knuckles were fat, but his skin was always soft. All the old-timers loved their pie. Freddy reckoned the old folks' home must not allow much in the way of sweets. "Charlie," She put her hands on her narrow hips. You know we only got pumpkin come Thanksgiving and Christmas. How about apple then, huh? You got apple? Hot, though. Not microwaved. We got apple fresh, she called over her shoulder to the kitchen. Paul's deep, gruff, almost solemn-sounding voice came back at once. Yeah, he said, as if he'd been waiting all day for her to come to work and ask him a question. Freddy! Charlie took hold of her hand in both of his. Apples fresh, Charlie. Why don't Paul make pumpkin more regular? I'm partial to fresh. Fresh pumpkin. Hot, too. I know, Charlie. She glanced at the front doors and saw the slow flood of old folks trudging in. But we got apple today. Freddy. A nasally, timid voice sounded from a thin man wearing big glasses over squinting eyes. His wallet hung from a rope around his neck, and he stood scarcely taller than the countertop. His upper lip was rigid, as if cocked and ready to tell somebody something of grave importance at any moment, so that his two front teeth were always exposed like a little rabbit. Hiya, Raymond. What can I get you? Freddy, can I have your phone number? I can't hear you, honey. She leaned forward. What do you want? I said, he whispered, can I have your phone number? Oh. Wah-ha! Charlie barked out a harsh, abrupt laugh. I don't think your wife would like that, Raymond, she said. But I could get you some pie. Freddy! Charlie leaned harder against the counter, squeezing her hand a little tighter. It'd be better if Paul made fresh pumpkin regular, you know. She don't mind. Raymond squinted up at her and edged closer to the counter. She got her own boyfriends, and she... Night, Fred. Freddy looked up. A tall man with a thick braided ponytail of brown and silver trailing between his muscled shoulders was heading for the front doors, his bowling ball bag clutched in his veiny fist. Hey, she smiled. How'd you bowl, French fries? His real name was not actually French Fries, but she called him that, for sake of the T-shirt he always wore. Done better, he shrugged, and gave her a little smile. How you doing? You ever stop wearing that T-shirt, I won't know what to call you. French Fries laughed his deep, hearty laugh that matched the sound of his Harley. Maybe next week I'll wear my shirt with pickles on it. How you think about that? Maybe next week I'll have to start calling you Pickles. Raymond, with his squinting eyes and rabbit teeth, standing barely 5'2", leaned toward Freddy. Maybe next week, he whispered, I'll kill myself. They all stood there a moment, not saying anything, hearing only the sounds of the bowling alley. Balls rolling down lanes, pins dancing off one another, the distant chatter of talking and cheering, and the quiet, indistinct music from Paul's kitchen radio. Welp, French Fries waved. Night. And she watched as he moseyed on through the foggy double doors and outside into the warm orange glow of the setting sun, where his faithful Harley sat in wait. When Freddy was serving food, bussing tables and cleaning, she'd sometimes happen to pass by French Fries. And when she did, she'd smell oil and gas and the leather of his old black jacket. And the smell of it, of him, made something within her narrow chest tingle. And every Saturday, a few minutes after 5, she heard that sound. The sound of his bike. In fact, found herself keeping an ear open for it. She'd listened to the grumble that rose in an instant to a chest-shaking blast, like a shotgun, when it first started up, and then that thunderous roar as it set off. Set off. To where? To somewhere. Somewhere into the distance. And the roar would fade like a passing storm, and the fading of that sound was somehow eerie. It made her think of all those long, wide-open roads. Roads where the bus couldn't, no, didn't, go. Roads that were yours for the taking when you straddled a Harley. And when you straddled a Harley, every road was yours. Although pushing 30, Freddy was, in many ways, naive to the ways of men. Naive in that, if she had only asked, maybe even simply suggested, French fries would have sat her on the back of his bike, like a cowboy and his horse, and drove her anywhere she wanted to go. For anywhere she wanted to go would have been fine by him. And it was invisible to her that he was just as lonely as she, for she did not acknowledge and scarcely recognized her own loneliness. "Ha!" Charlie laughed again like he'd just heard the punchline to a good joke. "I'm partial to sweet pickles on my liverwurst sandwiches," he just about yelled. "That's good, Charlie." Freddy cleared her throat and pulled her hand free of his soft, sweaty palms. She got the pad of paper and pencil from her apron pocket. "Now, you want a slice of apple or not?" "Course I do," he snapped. She did her best to pay no mind to his attitude. Old folks were apt to sudden mood changes, and scribbled on the pad. "Raymond?" "Chicken wings," he squinted. "2 orders, cheeseburger with chips, and a milkshake and a root beer float. You don't want no pie today?" He squinted harder. "Yeah." "Yeah, you do want pie?" "Yeah, pie." "Hey, Freddy." "Here, baby." Bridge came out of the kitchen and laid her checkered hand towel over Freddy's shoulder. "What?" She fingered the damp thing as she tried to fight back a knowing smile. "Paul's having you take over the back." "Now?" "Hey, Freddy." Raymond tried again. "No, after you tend to the front a couple hours." Bridge smiled, popping her bubble gum. "I wonder he let you out of his sight at all," she teased. "Stop it." Freddy took the towel and tried to lay a sharp slap against Bridge's flat bottom. But Bridge hurried around to the other side of the counter and hid behind Raymond. "Remember, Monday, I'll come fetch you for bingo." "Freddy," Raymond stammered. "We got bingo in the dining hall at 5, Freddy." "She knows you do, Charlie. Charlie, you tell her every week." Bridge squeezed Charlie's shoulder. "You can come, Freddy." Raymond pushed his glasses up his nose with his middle finger. "We can play bingo." "What time you coming by?" Freddy, ignoring Raymond, said to Bridge. "Let's grab us a drink at Blonde's on the way, so about 6? "I'll tell Carol." "Sure. Be careful getting home." "Always careful." "Only 'cause I tell you so." Bridge vanished through the front doors as the sound of the motorcycle rumbling and grumbling faded. Faded down the long country road. Carol swooped by again, the big tray now empty. "I gotta tell you something," she hissed. "I gotta tell you something, too." "What? Somebody in love with me, huh? Some big tall thing want a sip of this?" But she had a man, and was as faithful to him as he was to her. And they had 5 barefooted, giggling, tree-climbing little boys to prove it. "We going for drinks before bingo on Monday." "Is that all?" "We always go for drinks before bingo." She put her hand on her big hip and glared. "Thought you was gonna tell me my Prince Charming was on lane 4. "Your Prince Charming is in your bed every night," Freddy whispered, and gave her a little wink. "I'm your Prince Charming." Raymond squinted up at Carol, who looked like a giant compared to him. "I know, Raymond." Carol patted his little shoulder and went into the kitchen with her empty tray. Freddy turned back to the 2 men. "I'll get your orders in, fellas," she said. "Bring it out to your lane shortly." "Thanks, Freddy." "Okay, Freddy." Carol came out of the kitchen with a full tray of fries, wings, cheese curds, and drinks. "Want to come by my place about 6? We all ride together? You can stay the night." "Yeah, sure. Hey, I gotta get this food out. If we don't break together, I'll see you Monday for bingo." "Okay, honey." Carol scurried off, and Charlie and Raymond somehow made their way to where they were supposed to be. 2. They turned the overhead music down. Old Folkesley couldn't hear when it was too loud, which was just normal loud to everybody else. Freddy mopped the men's bathroom, sprayed some shoes with disinfectant, and cleared a couple tables. Soft blues flowed from Paul's little radio as she carried the dirties back behind the counter and into the kitchen. And there he stood, in front of the stoves, with his back to the doorway. He wasn't a tall man, but he was as heavy-set as one twice his size, and it wasn't all fat. He was strong. His stature was short but bulky and strewn with muscle. His thick forearms were freckled with little burns. He often unloaded the boxes from the big semi-trucks that came twice a month by himself. "Hey," he grunted without looking at her. Seemed to never really look at her. "Hi, Paulie." "How's things?" he grunted again. "Same's always." Freddy set the dirty dishes in the sink and started a fresh pot. Old Folks' League was partial to hot coffee at all hours. She turned and watched him as the coffee brewed beside her, a soft sizzling noise beneath the blues. She stared at his backside and watched sweat drip from his shaved head and down the back of his thick tan neck, darkening his white collar. Steam rose from large pots, and things sizzled on wide pans, and she watched as he sidestepped between the burners, flipping and stirring. How's the bus ride in?" he muttered. The way he didn't look at her when he asked his little questions, in fact, more curious questions than even Carol and Bridge asked, made it seem like he always wanted to say something more, but he never did. And sometimes that made her want to not answer him. So she'd let a long pause go by before replying. "Bus is a bus?" She crossed her arms and glared at the back of his sunburned, sweaty neck. "Yeah," he grunted, and still did not turn to face her. "Sure is." In second place to his barbecue wings were his pies. Most everybody ordered a slice of some kind of pie or other. Apple pie, chicken pot pie, shepherd's pie, and had a cup of hot coffee to go with, or a glass of cold beer to follow, and never dirtied more than a couple of dishes. There were also cheese curds, potato wedges, cold-cut sandwiches, nachos and meatballs, and all sorts of breakfast-type items. "Hey, Paul." "Huh?" Could you Fix me something for my supper break?" For just a moment he seemed to falter. "Sure," he said. "Sure." He turned and looked at her then. But it was only a glance, and only from the corner of his eye. "What'll you have?" And his voice wasn't as rugged and hard and stern as before. 3. Most everyone smoked, so out back was the sociable place to break, unless it was very busy. Then you'd end up alone. At 9 p.m., Freddy went into the kitchen and found a hot plate wrapped with tinfoil, pretty as a Christmas present, waiting for her on the counter. "This mine?" she said, knowing it was. "Unless you don't want it." Paul shrugged, and they both fell silent. She stood there, her hands resting behind her on the counter, feeling invisible as she stared at the back of him, as he stirred and flipped and chopped. "It's raining," he said. "I know," she snapped, and ran her finger along the smooth silver wrapping of her hot-covered meal. "I'll come with," he said, then quickly added, "Need me a smoke?" She snatched up the plate and started for the doorway. "Bring me out a hot cup, won't you?" And she didn't wait for a reply, but walked out of the kitchen and assumed he was watching her go. She went to the front counter and pulled her bag from underneath and took out her raincoat. She wouldn't have thought of it if Paul hadn't mentioned the rain. She peeked over her shoulder to make sure he wasn't watching. God forbid he saw he was right about something. She made her way through the bowling alley. It was crowded and noisy and full of fun, and although she wasn't working, she was also not one of the customers, and she carried her shining silver platter before her like a shield as she made her way out back. 4. It was dark outside, save for lightning flashing in the distance. She could smell cigarette smoke, and there were butts in the ashtray atop the garbage can. But she was alone. She tugged the heavy door closed behind her and sat down on the cold concrete step. She pulled the hood of her raincoat over her head and tore open the tinfoil. Hot, sweet steam washed over her face as it escaped from the silver wound. And she had to pause for a moment and just gaze upon the colourful bounty within. He'd fixed her hot cakes with sliced strawberries, thick bacon coated in barbecue sauce and molasses, flaky biscuits lathered in honey and butter, and 2 blueberry crepes dusted with powdered sugar. It was more than she imagined in both quantity and quality. But still, she didn't expect anything less. And that was the first time she realized she had expectations of him. High expectations of short, quiet Paul. Paul, the cook. And the realization gave her a funny feeling, an uneasy feeling. She picked up one of the crepes and licked the powdered sugar and blueberry juice from its crispy end. She sighed and closed her eyes. Cup of coffee'd do the trick right about now, she thought. She smiled to herself. She used to not be able to drink more than a cup of coffee without getting the shakes. The shakes. She stared into the dark distance, watching the quiet flashes in the sky. And she thought about last month. Last month was the last time she'd made the mistake she swore she'd never make again. In fact, every time she made that mistake, she'd sworn it would be the last. But the last month, really, would be the last. This time. 1 month ago. It was 10 in the morning. But for sake of the blackout curtains. Freddy's bedroom was dark as pitch as she lay in bed. She rolled onto her side, the brown waterbed flubbing and crinkling and waving beneath her, and took hold the glass of water from her nightstand. She sat up just enough to swallow half the glass, then lay back down. Only a moment later, she sat up again and finished it. "Ah," she moaned. "Never again." And her stomach churned as it decided if the water should stay or go. She shouldn't have had so much water. No, she shouldn't have had it so quickly. Her head hurt, and she was still thirsty. She squeezed her temples with her thumb and forefinger and focused on swallowing. And there was a sour taste on her tongue that made her glad to be alone. "Never again. Oh, please," she moaned and shut her eyes. "Oh, swear it. This time. This time." Her stomach gurgled. "Nope!" She threw her tangled sheets and thin quilt to the side. Clutching her abdomen with shaking hands, she padded to the bathroom in an oversized T-shirt and yesterday's sagging breeches. Hers was the smallest trailer in the park, but it had the finest view. From the little kitchen window could be seen the endless cornfields that glistened in the sunshine like a golden ocean, and the wide black road that stretched forever east and west. She knelt before the toilet, put her fingers into the back of her throat, and helped the sickness along. When her stomach was empty, she brushed her teeth and splashed her red face with cold water. She stood and saw herself in the mirror for just a second, and knew she'd never looked so ugly. And the sight of her pale, ugly face made her feel sick again. She took the bathroom garbage can and stepped back into the hall. The sunlight streaming in through the dirty kitchen windows shone hazy throughout the trailer, and it was an unsettling, almost upsetting contrast to the blackness of her quiet bedroom, and it made her sad sometimes to see the light like that. She went back to the bedroom, closed the door behind her, and crawled back into her flubbing, squishing, wobbling waterbed. She tossed and turned, and just when she thought she'd never fall asleep, she fell asleep. An hour later her alarm sounded. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding in her temples, and her eyeballs felt like they were full of broken glass. She was thirsty, but her cup was empty. So she just lay there, limp, useless as a wet rag, and fantasized about an ice-cold glass of water. But soon, disjointed recollections of things she'd said and done the night before came flooding in. And in an effort to push them away, she forced herself out of bed. Blood rushed from her head as she fumbled her way back through the hall and into the kitchen. The sunlight was brighter than before, and warm, and not so sad. She filled a glass with cold tap water from the kitchen sink and swallowed it down, and despite her fantasies, one glass was enough. She made a strong pot of coffee and shoved a frozen strudel into the toaster. When it popped out, hot and brown on the edges, she spread icing over it and poured heavy cream into her coffee and sat at the table. She had 2 chairs that didn't match, and a bar stool in the corner that was only used for mail, and her purse. And she always sat alone. She looked out through the kitchen window. The cornstalks glowed golden beneath the sun, and swayed in the breeze to and fro, to and fro, to and fro. She sipped her hot coffee and savoured the sweet blueberry strudel, and in her head she could hear the rustling sound the distant cornstalks made as they swayed. And all she wanted was to go back to bed and sleep for ever and ever and always. But instead she crawled into a steaming shower and lay down at the bottom of the tub, so the hot water fell upon her like a waterfall. She closed her eyes and thought about some place far away, some place where there were waterfalls, and she almost fell asleep. Maybe she did. And that made her think of people who died in the bath. Stinkin' thinkin'. That's what Daddy would say. She turned onto her side and felt the hot water anew as it hit her shoulder and hip, the side of her leg, and bottom of her feet. Hands trembling, she dressed in her uniform, pink dress, nude hose, and white heels. And she had to use the toilet 3 more times before she could leave. But she managed to walk that mile to the bus stop, needing the toilet again all the while, just as she'd done since she was 17. But she made it to work, and was behind the counter putting on her apron at 4:59, and Raymond and Charlie and all the others were already swarming her at the counter when she clocked in at 5. She tried to smile. "What'd you like to order?" "You smell like a bottle of vodka," Paul hissed from the kitchen doorway. She looked over just in time to see his bald head and white chef's coat disappear back into the kitchen. "Stop," she whispered, trying to sound teasing. "I do not." But she wondered if he wasn't lying. "What?" Raymond squinted up at her. "I can't hardly hear you." His front teeth showed beneath his rigid upper lip. She couldn't smell vodka, if what Paul said was true. But she could smell amaretto sour on Raymond's breath, and it made her tender stomach twist, and she tasted last night. "Hold on, Raymond." She turned and swept into the kitchen. "I do not. I took a shower this morning." She waited, but Paul made no answer. His back was to her as he stood in close conversation with Ernesto. "Do I really?" she whispered. "Paul!" "Hola, Miss Freddy!" "Hey, Ernesto." She smiled and tried not to blush as he stared at her, long and hard with those clear brown eyes. Ernesto wore his hair close, and when he was crouching in the kitchen, she could see he was starting to bald. His skin was dark, and his hands were worn, his thick knuckles ashen, and his teeth weren't straight, but his breath was always fresh. He walked toward her, still looking at her. "Can I taking you home today?" he said in a low whisper. Her head throbbed, and she had 10 hours to go. She glanced over at Paul. She didn't know why. And he still had his back to her, but his body had stiffened. She saw it in his shoulders, and the back of his neck was suddenly red. But he kept on with the food. "Yeah," she said, loud enough so Paul could hear. "Thanks, Ernesto. You're the best." She turned and made her way out of the kitchen, feeling not only Ernesto's eyes on her, but Paul's too. She went back to the crowded food counter, more at ease now that she didn't have to take the bus home. At 1 that morning, a green Toyota Corolla pulled right up front of the bowling alley. If Ernesto could have fit it through the front doors, he'd have pulled it inside for her. Freddy climbed in and buckled up, and Ernesto drove them away from the Christmas lights and into the darkness of the night. She slipped off her shoes and leaned her seat all the way back. He didn't say anything, and neither did she, and that was fine. That was one of the things about him. You didn't have to talk, and, somehow, he seemed to always know when you didn't want to. They pulled up to her trailer at 1:45 in the morning, and she was asleep until he opened her door. "It's a cool night," he said gently. She opened her eyes. Part of her wanted to stay in the car and let him keep driving. And he would have, too. Probably all the way back to Mexico. "It's a cool night," he said again. "Little bit." She took his outstretched hand in hers. "Want to sit out a minute?" "Which you? Of course." He smiled as he helped her up. "Always." She sat on the stoop outside her trailer and watched, eyes half open, as he went back to the car. He took something from the front passenger seat, then went to the trunk and pulled out something big and dark. "What you doing?" She leaned back a little. "Shh." He walked to her and handed her her white kitty heels, then wrapped a plaid blanket about her shoulders. "Oh." She relaxed. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He sat on the very bottom step, and all the way to the side. If he was any further away, he'd be on the grass. "The moon," he said. "Is bright tonight. Do you like?" She looked up at the shining glimmers in the dark sky. "It's pretty." "Beautiful," he said, but he was not looking at the moon. She cared for him, but not in the way he cared for her. He had a passion, a way of looking at her that let her know he loved her. And when she was around him, she never felt ugly. And in a strange way, almost like a sister to a brother, she loved him too. They sat on that stoop, as they had many nights before, and they talked, and they talked. And that night she let him hold her hand, and he held it in both of his, as delicate as if it was a flower whose petals might be stolen by the breeze. "Freddy, no matter where you are, wherever you go, even if you move away one day." "I'll never move." She laughed a little, but it was a sour sound. "Never leave this place. Freddy." He shook his head as if he understood something that was beyond her. "You will always, always be in my heart." He clutched his ashen fist to his thick breast. "That means you are part of me. So if you ever call for me, I will come. You understand? Ti amo mucho, Freddy." She looked away from the moon, and for the first time that day, stopped thinking about Dalton. She looked into Ernesto's dark eyes, his smooth face so close to hers. "You smell nice," she said. He squeezed her small hand gently in his large brown fingers and looked away. "My family, sometimes back home, we maybe drink too much." He laughed softly to himself. "And when the moon is full, we howl." "Howl?" "See, like wolves, like a wild wolf pack. You understand? Wolf pack." "Yeah," she grinned. "Wolf pack." She watched him from the corner of her eye as he looked up at the moon. She could feel his passion. Felt it in the strength of his large hand gently caressing hers. She could feel his admiration, his want. But sometimes she saw anger flash in those clear brown eyes of his. "Wolves bite," she whispered, teasing but also a little testing. He smiled gently at her. He moved up 2 steps and sat beside her, and rocked sideways, softly nudging his body against hers. "Never bite you," he said, and the teasing expression on his face changed. His full mouth parted, and he stared deep into her eyes. She thought he might lean in and kiss her then, and in that moment she did not pull away. "I will never hurt you, Freddy. Never," he said, and squeezed her hand. "Other men will, but I never will." "Other men?" she said, and darkness suddenly splashed across his eyes like fireworks in a night sky. She leaned away from him and sat rigid. He lowered his head and stared at his dirty black shoes and silently cursed himself in Spanish, for he somehow always managed to do that, to say or do something that made her pull away. And as she stared at the moon, she no longer looked like the Freddy he loved. His Freddy. Dalton had made it a point to stop by the kitchen counter and talk to her that day. That day of all days. It must have meant something. And here she was, sitting with Ernesto, letting him hold her hand, looking at his lips as they had parted, and almost letting him. She let her hand go limp, but he held tight and began stroking the open palm with his thick fingers, still as gentle as could be. "I have to go in," she mumbled, still not looking at him. "Oh, okay, Miss Freddy." She yanked her hand free and got to her feet. She glanced down at him and could see that thinning spot at the top of his head. "Sleep well." He stared up at her in the moonlight, like a lost puppy. "Maybe I be in you dreams." And the sight of that shiny, greasy circle atop his head made her hate him, if only for just a moment. "Thanks for the ride," she said, and shut the rickety screen door and locked it behind her. But he stayed on the stoop. She saw him when she pulled back her bedroom curtains after she'd showered and brushed. And the sight of him sitting there was somehow irritating. But she slept more deeply that night. And in the late morning, when her alarm sounded and pounded and beeped, and she peeked through her bedroom curtains again and saw that Ernesto was gone, there was a strange, uneasy feeling in her chest. She breakfasted, toileted, dressed, and caught that same bus, just as she'd done for the past 11 years, and walked that same mile she'd walked since she was 17. Chapter 6. A Place Like This. Freddy looked at the little blue tabletop before her, where 2,000 puzzle pieces lay scattered all over. She tossed the mangled plastic triangle to the side and watched as it skittered off the table, taking some of the puzzle pieces with it. She bent over and looked under the table and saw it had landed beside the chewed brown puck, and a dozen puzzle pieces lay strewn about the empty cereal box. When she sat back up, She heard something. A faint sound. Perhaps it was in her head. Only her heartbeat thudding in her head. But perhaps it was not. She stuck her little pinky fingers into her greasy ears. Oh, she sighed. For there was the whooshing. The pounding and whooshing and pounding and whooshing and... She glanced up at the drawn-on window on the living room wall. The only pretty thing in the whole place. And it wasn't even that pretty. After a moment, the pounding in her head sounded like thunder, and she imagined, could almost see it, horses stampeding across the black clouds in the drawn-on sky. And her ears pounded and whooshed, and pounded and whooshed. And then it passed, and she heard the noise no more, and so took her fingers from her dirty ears. Although her mouth was dry, and her eyes were heavy, she felt fine, like when she was little, and she'd nuzzle against Mama and fall fast asleep. Why was she thinking about Mama? She had been thinking about Paul, hadn't she? Just a moment ago. Although, had it been a moment? Or days? No, not Paul. Paul's hands. Those were what made food, and food, sure, of course, food. Food must have been on her mind. But she didn't feel hungry. Not any more. Just a little sleepy. She could go scoop a cup from the toilet. But she didn't like to take water too soon after she'd gone. But really, what did it matter? Whether she drank right away or waited 5 hours? How clean could the bowl get just from flushing? Ha! She gasped out a harsh laugh that was as vile as a belch, and the sound made the hair on the back of her neck erect. She started separating the edge pieces to the bottom right corner of the table, and the green pieces to the top left, and some other pieces toward the middle, and different ones toward the top right, and others in between, and after an hour, she couldn't recall the reasoning behind any of it. And pieces sprinkled off the table as she shuffled through them. There had been at least 3 different puzzles in that box. What kind of picture could 3 different puzzles make? Mama didn't like puzzles. Mama. What did Mama like? Mama liked beer, and boyfriends, and yelling, and boyfriends. Boyfriends liked beer, and yelling, and not Mama. Beer and yelling, and what? What's opposite of Mama? She thought of that big glass of water she kept beside her waterbed back in her trailer. That glass she'd filled to the brim before she'd pass out after drinking, because she knew she'd be reaching in the middle of the night. She'd looked out for herself, because who looks out for you, if not for you? She slid the corner pieces around and decided that she would have to smash these 3 different puzzles together, and that must be how the game is played. A smashed-together puzzle. In a place like this, she whispered. and smashed her fist atop mismatched pieces. And some from the nearby piles jumped off the table and skittered across the floor, and lay beside the plastic she'd mangled with her unbrushed teeth. Hardly anyone born in Plainfield ever left. But when they did, they always never came back. And Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble was no exception. Freddy never answered her door when Bridge and Carol sat outside her trailer honking. And she didn't answer when they ran up the stoop and banged on the screen door to take her to bingo. And the following day at 5 p.m., Charlie and Raymond stood in wait before an unmanned counter. And when Bridge and Carol swooped by to see why she'd stood them up, and saw that line of old folks piled up almost out the front doors with no Freddy waiting to help them, why, at 5 p.m., little Bert's lanes and games just about froze, still as a photograph, for Freddy was not there. Freddy had not walked in at 4:59 if it was raining, or 4:58 if it was not. And she'd not clocked in at 5 o'clock, just as she'd done 5 days a week, every week, since she was 17. Be 12 years next month. In the faraway city where Daddy went, a man named Orlo strode along the shorefront late one night, his gun on his hip, cigarettes in his trench coat pocket, and a lot on his mind. One of them, a case about a missing woman who worked at a bowling alley. A girl, really. Epilogue. Orlo. Amidst the ebb and flow of Saturday night that made the wide boardwalk narrow, Orlo walked alone. His dark trench coat was wrapped tight about his thick frame, and his head was tilted, a peculiar posture, but Orlo could not stand to have anything, not even a drop of rain, on the lenses of his spectacles. The very idea of it made him clench his hands into fists. With his head tilted this way, the brim of his hat shielded his face from the wet that drizzled sideways, and beneath his leather loafers the newly fallen leaves crunched, and he counted his crunchy steps in his head. 25, 26, 27. To his left was a vast blackness, shiny as an oil slick, where the wind sharpened its edges, and to his right the lights in the skyscrapers shone like stars. 37, 38, 30. He'd be 39 years old month after next, 1 year before 40. How different this place is, beautiful in its own way, under the moon, than it is under the sun. Orlo glanced sidelong to where a lanky, touristy-looking man spoke down to some wide-eyed floozy in a silly hat, saying the same crap that's been said since cities were built. He wanted to knock the weasel out. Instead, he just kept walking. But he'd lost count, so he started over. 1, 2, 3, 4. He did not move at the same pace as the crowd, nor did he walk slower. But he strode just a little faster, a little more sure-footed than the masses, and no one got in his way. He peered briefly at a slip of paper in his hand, and at the end of the block turned toward the city and crossed the street. As he started down the next block, for half a heartbeat, he slowed. A change so minute he himself did not notice. For there stood the red brick building. It was a place where there had always been fresh brewed coffee, pastries hot from the oven, and the owners, an old couple who loved their grandchildren, knew your name. But now the building was covered in graffiti. The windows were boarded, and the brick was crumbling at the corners. There was still black around the windows and door frame, and junkies infested the place like flies in a gaping carcass. There was something violating about it, something that made you feel dirty just from looking at the place, knowing what it used to be. Who used to own it? It made you want to take a baseball bat and wield it against the skulls of those invading decrepit, as one might wield a fly swatter. And there, in the back, the stairs to the cellar. The half a heartbeat passed, and Orlo returned to his normal pace. But he felt the thing, the strange thing, for which there was no name, suddenly clawing up his throat. He did his best to pay it no mind, for it would pass, as it always did. There were fewer people, and not as much light down this street. And in his dark attire, and face tucked between the erect collar of his coat and wide-brimmed hat, he blended with the night, and his steps were as sure-footed and quiet as a cat's. He moved as a full-bellied lion moves amidst its watchful, knowing prey, for prey does not flee from a feasted predator. Those hidden in the shadows of this forlorn road stayed where they stood, and after setting eyes upon Orlo, looked elsewhere for something to molest. To be continued. This has been The Strange Abduction of Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble, Part 1. Freddy Heddy Hardcrumble. Written by Laurie Ann Pokin. Narrated by Graham Mack. Copyright 2022 by Laurie Ann Pokin. Production copyright by Laurie Ann Pokin.